So let's think about this for a moment. If I look at this period, and I look at the growth of commercial agriculture, and people are moving out into the West during this period, Native Americans are being removed during this period, there's a massive wave of immigration occurring during this period. If I am farmers during this period, I am concerned about two things. The federal government during this period, because of the rise in power of political machines, has to, right, or has to, I don't say has to, does raise protective tariffs during this period. So if you are a farmer, you're consistently competing in the global marketplace. As early as 1873, farmers begin to realize that they need to band together to do something about selling their products adequately in the global marketplace. So the first organization that's actually established is called the Grange in 1873. What the Grangers essentially did, and this should sound familiar to all of us who think of the populists as the first progressives, is that they tried to create early forms of cooperatives. Well, what are cooperatives? Well, in the beginning, it was just farmers meeting together, right, who wanted to be more vocal about their political choices that they were going to be making, right? In other words, that it was more about informing farmers about who to vote for. But over time, it became more economic. In the 1880s, there's a new organization by 1886 called the Farmers Alliance. And what the Farmers Alliances did was they actually established what we think of as those true cooperatives, and some of them still exist to this day, like in the county where I'm from, Hopkins County, Texas, where we have a farmers cooperative. And what farmers essentially did was they pooled their assets together, right? So that it made it easier for them to buy machinery. It made it easier for them to buy seed. It made it easier for them to buy stock. And also in times of economic downturn, it made it easier for them to store products such as grain, so that whenever the price went up for their grain or the market recovered for their product, then they could do what? They could unload it and sell it in that marketplace and make more money off of their products, right? Farmers are beginning to become more politically involved during this period, but there's something else that's at work here. During the period, because of political machines, and because of the growing rural-urban divide in American politics that occurs at the end of the Civil War, there are very few pieces of meaningful legislation that get passed that are not related to currency issues on the one hand, or related to tariff issues on the other, with one exception. In 1884, a piece of legislation is passed largely due to the assassination of a president in 1881. That president had run on the issue of civil service reform. Okay, what is civil service reform? Because of the power of political machines could basically do what? Because of their tremendous financial capabilities. They could influence politicians to appointing one of their own into political posts, whether that person was actually qualified for the job or not. In 1881, a deranged man, to put it nicely, by the name of Charles Guiteau wants to be the ambassador to France to President James A. Garfield, right? Garfield becomes the President of the United States after Rutherford B. Hayes, probably most famous for barely getting into the White House, and most famous too for bringing Reconstruction to an end. When Hayes leaves the White House in 1880, Republicans nominate Garfield. What's interesting about Garfield is that his running mate, Chester A. Arthur, is a product of the New York political machine and establishment. And so when Guiteau wants to be ambassador to France, and Garfield doesn't give him the position or will not appoint him to it, he assassinates Garfield in the late summer of 1881. Garfield, despite the technological efforts of people such as Alexander Graham Bell, who actually invents a machine to try to find the bullet before President Garfield passes away, right? Despite their efforts, Garfield's death brings Chester A. Arthur into the White House. Political machines in New York celebrate because they have one of their own, right? But what's interesting about Arthur is this. Arthur commits political suicide and gets one of the most important acts in American history in this period passed. In 1884, it's called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And what the Pendleton Civil Service Act essentially did was it said that the federal government would step away from Andrew Jackson's spoils system in the 1820s and 1830s. And from this point forward, we would now hire people into federal jobs as federal employees, right, working for the public. They would now be hired by merit, right? In other words, they would take an examination to see what they were qualified to do. And then we would hire them based on those scores and based on their qualifications. This took away the power of political machines to be able to appoint one of their own, right? There is something else that happens during this period, and we sort of gloss over it, I think, but it's really important for us. In 1872, the Grant administration creates the first national park at Yellowstone in Wyoming, today's Wyoming and Montana. And with the growth of mining in the West, there is this beginning concern that industrial growth is beginning to harm the environment, particularly in the West. Now, we're not to Theodore Roosevelt until the dawn of the 20th century and really the establishment of national parks across the board to save portions of the American West or to begin to conserve it. But we are where we're becoming concerned about industrial growth, particularly in the American West. But there's something else too. Urban growth has meant problems in urban cities. For the first time after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, we now have fire departments established in major cities. In 1895, though it's a little bit beyond the timeline, we established the first sanitation departments in major cities. In other words, we begin cleaning up America's major cities. We start establishing the first sewage systems. That's because during this period, epidemic disease was rampant in America's cities because people were living in such close quarters with one another, and also because entire families were working together in America's industries in horrifying conditions too. The other thing that we saw during this period was with the growth of commercial farming. And that's with the invention of barbed wire in 1873 by Joseph Glidden. One of the things that we didn't address was the environmental issue of the disappearance of the buffalo. We have to think about how that happened for just a moment. Yes, it's true. White hunters kill millions of them, right? In an effort to do what? Well, to rob Native Americans of a major source of food and bring them to bay during this period while the Native American wars are occurring. But on the other hand, right, as cattle and ranching grew out into the American West, cattle also brought diseases that also infected the buffalo herds. Also, barbed wire did what? Buffalo were migratory. The Native Americans had been too, bless you. And so what we saw was barbed wire stopped these migrational patterns. In other words, it took them out of the ecology of the natural environment that they had been living in for thousands of years. And the other thing that we saw was simply this, right? We saw barbed wire essentially begin the process of fencing in what had been public land and the creation of large tracts of what become commercial farms throughout the West. So we see a pattern where Western cities are growing, but commercial farms are becoming larger, commercial ranches are becoming larger. And this is a major trend that's also occurring at the end of this period. I want to step back into something for just a moment here that I thought was really important that I wanted to get into and wrap up with. Okay. So the first attempts to regulate American business actually come during this period too. So the Interstate Commerce Commission is created in 1887, and it's created essentially to regulate the railroad industry. I know that really fits with the next time period, but we need to probably keep in mind that that's occurring during this period. All right. I think that's everything up here. Civil service reform also divided the Republican Party as well during the 1880s. People who supported Arthur's initiative behind the Pendleton Civil Service Act and people who did not. People who essentially believed, right, that if we trample on an old system, right, then it will not allow for freedom of choice and mobility. So we have people who are stalwarts who don't want to change the system at all. And we have people that are called mugwumps, people who essentially want civil service reform. The other thing that we have to mention, and this won't be but just a moment, but the Republican Party kind of does what is called waving the bloody shirt throughout the 1870s and 1880s. In other words, the Republican Party acquires votes by saying, we are the party that won the Civil War. And so therefore, what we see in American politics, the reason why things do not get done and there's this gridlock or stagnation in the 1870s and 1880s, is because the Republican Party appeals to the memories of the Civil War, right? It appeals also to corporate America during this period. Political machines mostly appeal to the Democratic Party and to working class voters during this period, but particularly immigrants during this period. The Democratic Party also is solidly conservative and into the South. So there's strange bedfellows here that we wouldn't think of in the 21st century. We wouldn't think of a Democratic Party in the South, which is essentially highly conservative, right? And really the party that begins the process of segregation in the South during this period. We wouldn't think of them as being the same party that's behind the political machines, for example, that's bringing in immigrants during this period. What leads to the divide in which we see, for example, the Democratic Party sort of stepping away from that is what happens, of course, during the 1890s in American politics with the rise of populism on the one hand. Populists, and I'm kind of going back for a moment, populists did want to appeal to the labor union movement. They do want to appeal to working white class voters. The problem is that they also want immigration restrictions. So, in other words, to say that immigration is a divisive issue only today would be a major mistake. In other words, immigration's always been a divisive political issue in American life. And the Democratic Party becomes the party of the South during this period, as it had been before the Civil War. But maybe much more so, and maybe much more conservative, right? Also, it becomes a party that is almost removed from national politics. The only Democratic president to be elected from 1865 until Woodrow Wilson's election in 1912 is Grover Cleveland. And he doesn't even serve consecutive terms. And that's because of the partisan gridlock between the parties that we see during this period and who they appeal to. So, immigrant voters on the one hand in the Democratic Party and the party of the South, right? A strange place to be. And then corporate America on the one hand to the Republican Party, but also it's the party of what, if you think about it? It's the party of Lincoln. So it's the party of commercial farmers in the West too. So, think about the Democratic Party and its evolution. It becomes the party of the cities during this period. And slowly the Democratic Party does what? Becomes the party of the cities in the modern era. Whereas the Republican Party has remained what? Very much still a corporate party to this day. We could safely say that that's one component of the Civil War that still remains somewhat true in American politics.